This is super timely. The new coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2 might very well become a pandemic. So let's see what will factor into that. There are a couple of things you need to know. Let's first talk about the basic reproductive ratio called R0. It applies to a situation where everyone in the population is susceptible and no control measures are taken. So we're talking about a population that has no immunity to the pathogen. They're seeing the virus or bacteria for the very first time. R0 gives you the number of new cases that an existing case can generate over time on average. So let's take an arbitrary population and say that this guy has the disease and transmits it to this guy over here. And this guy transmits it to that guy. So on average, one case gives the disease to one other person. So R0 is equal to 1. In a scenario where R0 is equal to 1, the population of infected individuals stays constant. Now let's look at another fictitious population where one infected person infects 3 other individuals on average. So R0 is equal to 3. So this guy gives it to these 3 people, and these 3 people give it to 3 more people in turn. I think you can already tell that what we're looking at here is an exponential growth curve that looks something like this. So the number of infected patients increases. So as we've seen, when R0 is equal to 1, the group size will stay constant. When R0 is greater than 1, the group of infected individuals will grow. And what will happen if R0 is below 1? Well, I think you guessed it. If that happens, the population of infected individuals will get smaller and smaller over time. So what else do we need to know in order to tell if an epidemic is going to spread fast and wide apart from R0? Well, we need to know what is called the serial interval. What is the serial interval? Well, let's say this guy, Bob, infected this girl, Pam, with the new coronavirus. The serial interval would correspond to the time it takes between symptom onset in Bob to symptom onset in Pam. Essentially, the serial interval is a measure of how fast the disease spreads from one person to the next. Let's take the example of a fictitious population of 1,000 uninfected individuals who have never been exposed to the coronavirus, let's say. Let's assume that this guy enters the population because he has just returned from Wuhan, China. Now, I will make up some numbers for demonstration purposes. Let's say R0 was 5 and the serial interval was 10 days. So in the first 10 days, this guy infects 5 people. They develop disease. After 10 more days, each of these individuals infects 5 more people in turn, and they develop the disease. So we have now 25 people, and after 10 more days, each one of those 25 people infects 5 people each. So we end up with 125 new infected individuals in the last 10-day period. So overall, we end up with 156 infected individuals in this population of 1,000. So what's the incidence of disease? That's 156 per 1,000 per 30 days, or 5.2 per 1,000 per day. Let's take a different serial interval and see what happens. Let's now say that the serial interval is 30 days instead of 10. Now that initial case infects 5 people over the entire month, so we end up with 6 infected cases. So what's the incidence now? 6 cases per 1,000 per 30 days corresponds to 0.2 per 1,000 per day. So you see, changing the serial interval really makes a big difference. So what's the serial interval for the novel coronavirus? Well, different authors describe different numbers. It's generally thought to be somewhere around 7.5 days, maybe even shorter. For comparison, the serial interval for influenza has been estimated at somewhere between 2.2 and 2.8. So here are the R0s and serial intervals of previous flu pandemics, and if we compare that to those of the SARS-CoV-2, we see that the coronavirus has a worse R0, meaning that one patient infects more individuals than is the case for influenza. On the other hand, the serial interval for the coronavirus is longer, which might buy us some time. So I hope you now understand why with a low reproductive ratio and a high serial interval, you'll get an epidemic that will propagate more slowly, whereas with a higher reproductive ratio and a low serial interval, you'll get a much more threatening epidemic that will propagate much faster. For more lectures on important medical concepts and skills, visit us at www.medmastery.com and register for a trial account to get access to free lessons, downloads, and updates. See you next time. One would be the route of transmission, so R0 will vary depending if the route of transmission is fecal-oral or if it's airborne via droplets, for example. Both modes of transmission have been described for the new coronavirus. Another factor that influences the value of R0 is the epidemiological system in which the pathogen is transmitted. So R0 will be slightly different in various geographic regions with different social and cultural behaviors, for example. Here's a quick formula how you can think of R0. It basically depends on the susceptible population that an infected person is going to encounter per time unit, let's say per days, times the average duration of infectiousness in days, times the average probability that transmission will take place per unit of contact. So each time an infectious individual interacts with another susceptible person, which is largely a measure of pathogen virulence, the ability of a pathogen to cause disease. It has been estimated by various authors that R0 for COVID-19 is somewhere between 2 and 3. Let's compare that to the values of R0 seen during flu pandemics. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, R0 was 1.8. In 1957, it was 1.65. In 1968, it was 1.8 again. And in 2009, it was 1.46. So when it comes to R0, SARS-CoV-2 is quite a bit more scary than influenza, isn't it?